Welcome to World Builders Anonymous. Kick that world building addiction and actually finish that novel with your hosts Vito and John.
Not all set. Now all set.
All set?
Not all set. Now all set. Okay, for real this time. Oh wait, no, I lost my show notes. And we're good.
Should write your show notes on paper so you don't have to find them all over the place.
Where would I even find paper? This is 2018.
Just go down, chop a tree outside, and make paper.
I live in an apartment. They would get really
works.
mad.
I think I saw Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood episode where they showed you how to make paper one time. I can't.
We
remember.
made paper once.
Oh, we did. That's right.
We did. It was
Hashtag
crappy.
homeschooling.
Hashtag homeschool. We made paper.
But did we really though? We started with paper and then made paper out of paper or something like that.
I don't remember. I do not remember the process.
Had something to do
one
with
bit.
jeans, didn't it? Didn't we take jean fibers and
You know,
do
that
something?
sounds right. But it was 15 years ago at least.
Homeschool projects. So fun. So much
Homeschool
fun.
projects.
All right. Are we ready to go?
I'm ready to go.
All right. Welcome everyone to our little podcast, and we are so glad you're here.
We're glad
so
you're
go
here.
and grab a beer. Yeah, unless you're in the car, don't grab a beer if you're
Or
in
me,
the car.
in which case you grab a water.
Yeah, Johnny doesn't drink. I am an Irish musician, so I do drink.
Who is Italian?
I am not Irish. I am Sicilian. We have some Scotch Irish in our background, but not very much.
Not enough. Not enough to warrant.
Mom told me that we call our grandmother Grammy. Mom told me that Grammy has or her maiden name was Wallace, and so if that's the case, then I'm going to assume that we are descended from William Wallace.
I've kind of always held that in my brain like it's true. I think I've even told people that before.
Heck, I think that Grammy and Popo actually have told us that before.
I think it was Aunt Janie who told us that.
Or somebody in our family.
Someone
has
told me that I was related to William Wallace, and I just didn't question them.
Oh, I took that, and now whenever I go to my Scottish festivals that I play at, I wear a Wallace pin. Now I need to get a Wallace curtain. Yeah, and all this kind of stuff. I really want to do the DNA test because we know exactly where we come from on Dad's side and to an extent from Mom's side, but there's some on Mom's side that we don't know as much about, like the Scotch Irish side, and there's some Native American back there somewhere, and all kinds of things. So I think that'd be super interesting, and then I would know for sure if whether I'm appropriating or not when I wear the tartan.
Am I inherently racist?
I don't know.
I don't know.
It's hard to know. I don't know. No, I don't think so. But anyway, yes, welcome to the podcast.
After that stellar intro.
Oh man, it's doing so good. John, what did you do this week? Let's just have a conversation. Let's
Yeah, because this wasn't planned at all.
This wasn't planned at all. This is not a segue that I told Johnny I was going to do beforehand.
This is not scripted.
How did your week go? And did that in any way inform your thinking about world building and or writing?
Oh hey,
John?
Oh hey! It's funny that you should ask me that question. I did a thing this week, as I tend to do.
A thing.
I went rock climbing for the first time in maybe even 10 years. I've only gone a couple times ever, and I went with my sister.
Although you watched Free Solo, so now you know.
I watched Free Solo, and I'm like, oh, now I have to climb things.
Although, if you guys have not seen Free Solo, that documentary about Alex Hanault climbing El Capitan in Yellowstone, that is one of the most amazing things both of us have ever seen in our entire lives. You should
stop listening to this
definitely check it out.
podcast and go watch it.
Oh my gosh!
Just kidding. Don't stop listening to the podcast. No, I went rock climbing, and maybe it's the fact that we have this podcast, but I kind of I start to view things through a certain lens in general. Like, oh, what can I learn for world building or for my book from this experience? And there's a direct correlation between rock climbing and specific element, not necessarily of world building, but of character, I guess. And I'm sure you've read a book or watched a movie where you saw a character scale a wall or a cliff face. Without there's no indication that they have experience climbing stuff. They're just oh, he's a physical athletic character. He can climb a wall.
Right,
No,
he's strong, right? He's brawny.
No, it's so hard, and I suck at it.
It is deceptively difficult. Yes.
They have Skype is now enabled.
Oh,
I
good.
wasn't aware that I was not on Skype already.
Well,
okay.
That's weird.
That's very strange. Anyway. Like they have levels from V0 to like V12 at the climbing gym. And I can only do like up to V1. And I can like attempt a V2. Josie was like climbing all over everything like a crazy person.
Josie is our sister, by the way.
Oh, she's way better than I am at it. But yeah, that's just the thing. And it goes to show like some of the things that characters do in books and movies are just so much harder than they let on.
Yeah, definitely.
And climbing stuff is one of them. You know, I even with great handholds, like it's just really hard.
Yeah,
so,
one of those things that you wouldn't really know much about if you didn't
Yeah.
already do it or something like that, and then just assume that your character could go ahead and just figure it
Right.
out, whatever.
Yeah,
But
it just
I
goes
mean,
to. Huh?
Sorry, I was just gonna say it depends on the tone of your book, though, too. Like if
It does,
the
yeah.
tone of your book is like this guy is kind of like a Superman or Superwoman or whatever, and like they can, they're just so good at everything, and it's kind of a James Bond type character. Of course, James Bond would have training and that kind of stuff, I guess.
Yeah,
but whatever.
right.
But that's one thing. But if you're going for like a more realistic kind of Aragon type thing, where they don't really know what they're doing, they're just kind of a regular person at the start of the story, and they haven't
Pre-transformation
developed.
Aragon.
Exactly. Like they're pre-transformation for whatever your character is. They haven't gone on their journey. They haven't learned their lessons yet and that kind of stuff. It's good to like have them try something, but then fail at it too. And that might
Or even be competent at their own sort of wheelhouse, but outside that, they're humans.
right. And that actually, those limitations make a character more interesting. Like in
Yes.
Aragon, actually, the first time he tries to ride the dragon, he doesn't have a saddle or anything, and like his legs get torn up on her scales, and he nearly dies. And
Yeah,
it's
I always
just,
thought
like,
that was
this
a cool
crazy
scene.
experience, yeah, and it's very visceral, and it really makes you like root for him and like want him to get better at that thing, because that's a cool
Right.
thing that he sucks at right now. But it's you can see the potential of it kind of, and there's consequences. He like really hurts himself doing that.
And he has to deal with the ramifications of that in like his legs scab over, and he has a really tough time with it for a while.
And even and I think part of what makes that effective is just like the way he describes like the scabs like cracking on the inside of his thighs.
Yeah,
and that kind
right.
of stuff, and just like, oh man, ouch, that doesn't. Feel
You
good.
hurt thinking about it.
Yeah, really making that a visceral description, right there is definitely a good way to go. But yeah, experiencing consequences for trying hard things and failing is definitely a good way to go, especially in the beginning of the story. Like I said before, the characters really developed a whole lot.
Yeah.
And throughout, if they try to do something that they're not actually good at, but you can decide whether they actually need to try that thing or not.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that's a tool to use.
yeah. So speaking of using personal experience to leverage into understanding how to write something and or world
Ooh,
build,
That was
why
not
don't we-
a planned segue.
well, I'm just that good at this. Why don't we launch into our main topic for the day?
Yes, we are continuing our Writer's Guide series, although we're thinking we're going to stop calling it Writer's Guide because it's not an exhaustive guide to a certain topic that we're doing. It's more of a world-building tips kind of thing, especially for first drafts. But again, we have not really figured out a good title to elicit that, or give you that information in a short, title yet.
Yeah.
But basically, I think world-building tips might be a good one. But anyway, we've been talking the last few weeks about different topics from a world-building perspective. Everything you need to know for your first draft, basically, or things you should know for your first draft. Not
Yeah.
necessarily everything, because we're not that smart.
We don't have that much time on our hands.
No. But we will be writing an article about this topic too, and be posting it either tonight or tomorrow morning. That's the 22nd or the 23rd of October. This is actually a topic we both know quite a bit about. I am a professional musician by trade, and music is the topic for today. World-building
Yes.
music, how to make it realistic, how to write characters who play music, how to create instruments and tie music into your culture of your
Right.
world.
Yeah,
and all that kind of
utilizing
stuff.
Yeah, utilizing music for the purpose that it sort of fulfills in actual real life, where
Right.
it's or a reflection to an extent of culture, and it embodies what is going on in your culture at the time. And it's not just musical instruments being played for the sake of it. Like music as a whole generally has a significant cultural meaning, and that can really play into your culture.
And really, the best example I've seen of this in any book is Patrick Rothfuss in
Yes.
Name of the Wind. Kavoth is his character. And apparently, Patrick Rothfuss is not a musician.
I remember you when you first read it, you were talking to me about it or someone about it, and you said something to the effect of I would be surprised if he was not a musician of some kind.
Yeah,
because he does it so well, and I would agree with that.
Just his descriptions of what it's like to play an instrument, and this gets into what we'll talk about in a second, because Kavoth is very talented at his instrument from the very beginning of the story.
Yes,
and so that's one element of what it's like to play an instrument. If you're just so good at one thing and know the music you're playing so well, what does that feel like? But it's a whole other thing to pick up a new instrument and try to play it, or even an instrument you know and try to learn a new tune or a new song,
right?
And not have it in your fingers just yet. So there's different kinds of playing, and it feels different depending on what the situation is. We'll go into that a little bit, because Johnny has also a good bit of musical experience, but not as much as I do.
Yeah,
so we can kind of come at it from our different perspectives a little bit.
Not a musician by trade by any means, but I've played a few instruments, primarily guitar, for the last 8 years now.
Yeah, all of us have a pretty darn good ear. All of the kids in our family,
Seems
all
that
of our
way.
sisters.
It's a curse.
Yeah, we can all pick up things pretty quickly, instrument-wise, but I'm the only one who made it into a trade, I guess.
Yes.
But yeah, so we'll talk about that. We also want to talk about a little bit of interesting ideas, ideas about both instruments, types of music, but also how to integrate it into your world in an interesting way. Again, not an exhaustive guide, but some ideas, some tips. Yeah. So let's get started with what is it like to play an instrument? How would you portray that on the page as you're writing?
Yeah.
And it's not something that we want people to feel like they need to get perfect, especially on their first draft. But having some idea will help you, I think, just be able to more convincingly write a musician character. Whether it's
and
like
feel
a bard or anything like that, or a musician in the church, religious ceremony, anything like that.
Yeah, and it helps you to feel out, because the way you play an instrument and what that feels like, I think it could have a significant impact on the character in general. That background and what that means to them and how that affects them. That can play significantly into your character and thus change a lot of things.
Yeah, and it's an interesting side to have to a character, to have them be a musician and that be a part of who they are in some significant way. Just like, again, if you've read Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, that is a big part of that character, even though he's not, necessarily always playing music. That is something that he can whip out kind of at will, and something that means a lot to him. It's tied into his background with his parents and his troupe from when he was a kid. And I won't spoil anything in the story, but that becomes something that's very meaningful for him later on.
For sure.
And you can add a lot of depth to a character that way. But yeah, so I play mostly violin, but I also play guitar, viola, mandolin, banjo, tenor banjo, anything with
pretty
strings
much
really
whatever.
At this point. Yeah, I mean that's part of the what we can talk about too is classes of instruments are pretty similar to each other. Like if you can play a saxophone, you can figure out a clarinet pretty easily because they're both reeds and they both have a similar fingering structure. Most stringed instruments are very, very similar to each other because the mechanism that's being used to produce the music is the vibrating string, and you control the pitch by essentially shortening that string with your finger by placing it on the fingerboard most of the time and essentially making that string shorter or longer. To make the pitch different. And that's pretty much the case with all string instruments. And the biggest difference is how they're either strummed or bowed or hammered or whatever it is. Like a piano, you strike the keys, you strike the strings with a little hammer by pressing the keys. Same with like a hammered dulcimer, you physically hammer the strings. Same with something like fiddlesticks. If you ever heard of that, that's actually a thing.
Yes, right.
Two like wooden sticks that you actually hit. Yeah, you actually hit the strings of a violin with it. It's kind of got this cool percussive effect. And there's actually a technique with a violin bow where you turn it over and hit the strings with the wooden part. It's called col legno, which means with the wood in Italian. So there's different ways of striking or making the strings make their sound, but ultimately it's kind of the same thing. So if this were like a role-playing game and your bard had 15 skill on the lute, he could probably figure out a mandolin with like maybe some sort of disadvantage and still play
at a
it,
lesser skill level, but still able to do it.
Yeah, still.
I'll always remember. You were off at college, I think, and I bought a ukulele for myself, and I learned to play it for a couple weeks, and I got okay at it. It took me a little bit to figure out because I'm not as skilled a musician as you. And I played the guitar before that, but never the ukulele. And I got where I was okay at it. and then you came home from college and like picked it up, and the first time you ever picked it up, you're like better than I was already. Ah, dang it.
And there's difference there too, because like a ukulele is primarily a chord instrument, whereas the fiddle is mainly a melody instrument. You don't play chords on a fiddle usually. So I have like some skill on like say a guitar, playing melodies more than I do chords, because that requires a different sort of way of thinking. You're thinking in multiple notes at a time, moving in shapes up and down the neck, whereas I'm not used to that on a violin. I play one note at a time in sort of scale patterns. So that's kind of an interesting difference too. That's a little in depth though. I don't know if you need to know too much about that.
To you, what would you say it feels like to play music? Like, I mean, I guess to start with, just say music that you know well. Like, what does that feel like?
Yeah, so like music that I play every single week here in LA with my Irish bands, Celtic bands. There's a lot of songs that I play every single week, multiple times usually. And by now, I've done that for several years now, and I know those like the back of my hand. And it's very possible to even like zone out and like watch the TV across the bar or something like that while you're playing the song if you know something that well. And actually, it's almost more of a challenge to make yourself, engage with the music sometimes, because you can go on autopilot, like literally not, think about what you're doing. And it just kind of, it almost just plays itself at that point. It's really
there's
like
crazy. There's a stereotype sometimes, I think, where a character is really good at something will like, oh, this is just boring. I'm so good at this that I don't even have to pay attention. But that's kind of true to an extent with this one then.
It can be, yeah. It depends on the circumstances. Like if there's like a lot of people up and dancing and you're excited about it and they're excited and having a great time, then you might like try something different that you don't usually try, especially in something like Irish music or folk music, where it's not like this set piece that you're playing. You're not reading notes off a page that somebody wrote, and like you're playing a song and interpreting it your way, essentially. Even if you've done it a million times and you know the song really well, you can still riff on it. Like you can add a little run here, you can add a little, trill here or whatever, ornamentation, fills, that kind of stuff. And that's especially when you're really motivated to do it. If you're really excited, there's like something exciting going on. If you're in a big concert, that kind of thing, and you're in front of a bunch of people who are really into what you're doing, you might try to show off a little bit if you're feeling good. And that kind of stuff. And that's another thing too. Like stage fright isn't really a thing for me anymore. And for most musicians at this sort of level where you're playing professionally every single week, most people I've met don't have any sort of stage fright. It's very routine for them, unless they're in like a brand new place, maybe with a lot of people. Like the last time I remember being really nervous for a show was probably when I played in Salina, Kansas, for with Zane Williams, the guy I played for in Texas, who you should also check out for sure, Zane Williams. We were opening for Alan Jackson, though. It was like the biggest show I've ever played. And it was like, several thousand people in the audience. And we're on a big stage, biggest stage I'd ever been on. And that was a little nerve-wracking, especially because the sound was different. We were wearing in-ear monitors. I wasn't used to that, all that kind of thing. Again, not super important for purpose of this. But the point is, it depends on the context. If you're in a familiar location with familiar people playing familiar songs, you don't really have to think about it too much.
Yeah. So, like, in your story, you have not spoiling anything. It's important, I don't think.
Yeah.
Your character is a musician. Not by trade necessarily, but it's something he does.
Yeah.
And he's playing in sort of the bar room of the local bar.
Yeah.
That wouldn't be a pressure situation for him. That's just a Friday night.
Yeah, that's just like a Friday night at the pub. They do this every week. Get like a session going, very, very Irish, and they just play tunes that they all know and have a good time and drink and
it's not a pressure situation,
right? And as my story opens, like some news has just reached them of something that's happened on the other side of the island that excites them quite a bit, and so it's like this jovial atmosphere, and they're just like having a great time, and they're almost focusing more on what's happening around them than they are on playing. Whereas it can be different. Like if I'm learning a new tune, if I'm sitting in on a session, as I do sometimes, where I don't know the tune that's being played, then it's a matter of really focusing on listening and trying to figure out the pattern of this tune. And that's where your mind has to disengage from what's going on around it and really focus on what you're doing. Because even if you are like I said, improvising and playing around with a tune that you already know really well, you're still very, very, I guess you're still focused on what's, going on outside of you in a big way. At least I am. You can kind of focus on the crowd. You can focus on, this guy over in the corner who's, having a great time and dancing or something like that while you're doing your thing.
Yeah.
But if you don't know something as well, that's when you need to, really focus on yourself and your fingers.
Right.
Especially if you're reading music. It depends on your skill with reading music, and if written music is even a thing in your world. But if somebody is reading a sheet of music that they don't know yet, and they're not amazing at reading, which most people aren't, then that's going to be something they have to really focus on and be like, okay, they might miss a couple notes and stumble over it and like, get back on track, that kind of thing. So that can be a thing as well.
Yeah. And I'll quickly go over mine so we can move on to something else in this topic. But as maybe an amateur musician or a hobby musician, you might call me, in the rare occasion that I play live, and I don't do it often by any means, it's nerve-wracking for me every time, like no matter what, especially if I'm singing, because that's not something I do
or if you're
well
in front
at all.
Of people.
And in case you couldn't tell by our introduction, I'm not a singer by any stretch of the imagination.
That was me singing, by the way.
I sang harmony, okay?
Oh, you did? I didn't even hear
I sang harmony.
See, I was too focused on me. I was singing something unfamiliar, see?
But yeah, so that is nerve-wracking. So if your character's not like a trained musician who's done this thousands of times and is super focused in on what they're doing and their craft and everything, it remains a nerve-wracking thing. At least for me, that's true. And I'm much more limited than Vito. When I'm playing, I rarely have the ability to sort of zone out a little bit and not focus because I'm not skilled enough to go on autopilot. I have to kind of focus on what I'm doing, and if I let my concentration, lapse, I end up, getting behind the rhythm or hitting a wrong chord or stuff like that. So, based on your skill level and the experience of your character in whatever he's doing, and if it's a new instrument or if it's a new song even, there's going to be a certain amount of nerves or mistakes, and once you make one mistake, they kind of compound because you get in your own head about stuff.
Yeah,
so,
you might have to look at the strings. You probably wouldn't notice a lot of stuff going on around you. You'd probably feel pretty nervous. You'd probably get kind of like almost panic a little bit sometimes if you're making mistakes and like not be able to get back on track and that kind of thing.
Right. And for me, like when that happens, when I have to like look at the strings and focus, I feel like I'm not performing well enough. Like I feel like I'm not putting on any kind of a show to an extent that I'm interesting to watch at this point. Like I'm just sitting there looking at my strings like a little child, like, oh, I'm just trying to play my little instrument, and that you lose your confidence pretty quick doing that.
Yeah, that performance aspect is definitely something that's a kind of a separate skill almost, because I got real good at playing the violin. Before college, I was, continuing to train through college and that kind of stuff, and I was quite good at playing, but I was so shy as a kid, and it took me a long time to come out of my shell, just socially in general, and that translated to my playing. It wasn't until I started playing really with Zane Williams in Texas, but then after moving to California especially, that I started to get comfortable enough and also emphasize my focus on the performance aspect enough and realize that that's an important thing that I actually should probably try to, focus on a little bit. That I started kind of, performing, kind of looking at people and, jumping around a little bit and that kind of thing, having fun with it and actually having fun with it, not just forcing myself to do it, but actually making that something that's fun to do.
Natural.
Because I got used to it. But that's definitely something that's not necessarily a natural part of every musician. There's a lot of musicians, especially classical musicians, but, a lot of different ones that are kind of the shoegazers, we call them, especially some singers.
Right. They're
just kind of like looking, down at their mic and kind of closing their eyes maybe, or looking down at their shoes and just kind of doing their thing. And they might be really good at what they do, but that is a separate aspect of it for sure,
Right, and that can definitely play out in a character in your story. Like there are traits of a certain person that definitely follow through into the way you play and the way you perform. So, like you said, if your character is someone who's kind of naturally shy, it doesn't make sense to have them go in and have this mind blowing performance where they are alive on the stage and getting the crowd really amped up. That might not make the most sense as like a as a character trait to have those two go together.
Unless maybe you want to like call specific attention to this weird contrast they have in their personality.
That's
they
true.
just kind
You
of
can do
turn
that
on stage and then they come off and they're just like, yeah, okay, here we go.
Yeah, that was sad. I don't know what happened to me. I kind of blacked out for a minute.
Hey, what happened? Wow, did I do that? Was that me? Oh, wow. But yeah, if you have any more questions about that, you can email us at our email address, which I forget because
Do you remember it this time? You ask me every week.
I do. Is it wbapodcast@gmail.com?
You did it.
Yeah,
you did it.
I did.
Good job, Vito. You get a virtual gold star.
Right. And if you were like, David Howley or Fergal Scale listening to this or something like that, you should take me on tour. That'd be super cool. Yeah. Anyway, we actually have no listeners in Ireland yet.
That's a glaring gap.
Very weird. We have actually Great Britain, or I guess the British Isles, are like our second highest listenership right now, I think, after the United States. And mostly in London and the southern part of England, and actually in Wales as well. But we don't have any Irish yet. We got our first Brazilian listeners this past week, but we still don't have any Irish people.
You know what? Take what I can get.
Yeah, I don't know. And in fact, I wanted to say hello today in Portuguese because we have a decent amount of Portuguese and now Brazilian listeners who speak Portuguese. And I think it's bom dia, but I can't remember now.
You wouldn't. Don't ask
Portuguese.
me. Anyway. Not my wheelhouse. I don't know if you noticed, by the way, but I did actually send you a gold star in Skype.
I'm not looking at Skype right now. Why would I be doing that? I'm looking at my notes like a responsible podcaster, John.
Like a professional.
Like a professional.
Stop sending me gold stars. Shall we move on to the next sort of subtopic here?
Like we can talk about world building, different interesting instruments/musical ideas, kind of, before we get into more of the religious/cultural aspect of integrating music into your world. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do that's not just, a lute, or something like that.
Which you can do. There's nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with lutes. That's definitely a good, medieval/Renaissance, instrument to have.
And it sounds very fantasy.
Yeah, it sounds very. That's part of the problem too. It sounds so stereotypically fantasy. It's so common within that genre. I really like. There's a lot of reasons to like this, but The Witcher is one of my new favorite series, both of books and games. And the soundtrack they made for the game incorporates a lot of really cool Polish folk musicians and instruments. There's some cool little tiny bowed instruments that I don't know the name of. But if anyone wants to look up some cool stuff, look up the recording sessions they did for those. There's like little mini documentaries. I think they're in Polish, but there's subtitles, I think. For some cool musical instrument things that go into a kind of a fantasy setting. One of which is one of the ones we wanted to talk about, which is a really interesting instrument called the hurdy-gurdy. I don't know if any of you have heard of that. It sounds super weird.
I think it's the most fun instrument to say.
It is probably the most fun instrument
hurdy-gurdy.
to say. But there's a lot of cool instruments like that one. The nickel harpa is another one. It's like this big... it looks like a big viola almost, but it's got wooden keys on the side that these keys press in to press on the strings instead of your fingers pressing directly on the strings. So it's like a keyed violin almost.
It's crazy.
Super cool. And the hurdy-gurdy is similar, except instead of a bow, you have this wheel that you turn. I think it's covered in wool or something like that. And that basically continuously bows the strings as long as you're turning this wheel. And this is a good one to talk about in music's, very common connection to religion, actually, and other cultural things. Johnny, do you want to tell me tell the story you told me about the origins of the hurdy-gurdy?
Yeah, sure. So nowadays, and ever since really, I guess the Victorian era, don't quote me on that, hurdy-gurdys have been vaguely guitar-sized. That's a fine description of their size. They're smaller than that, but, handheld, essentially. You can hold them in your lap and play them.
Like mandolin size, really.
Yeah. And the original hurdy-gurdy, though, was 10 times bigger. Think of like a church organ, like a big cathedral organ that takes up a lot of space. It was like that, and it took two people to play it. One person to turn the crank, and the other one press the buttons to press the strings to make the notes. It was a two-person job to play this thing, but it was played as sort of a predecessor to the organ in church services. It had a liturgical function, and that's sort of indicative often of the maybe even some of the innovation in musical instruments, and that technology had to do with church and religious services and ritual. I wouldn't say they were seen as like holy or uniquely spiritual things, but there were definitely, some instruments were definitely part of, traditional, church services. And eventually they were phased out. It was replaced by the traditional church organ.
Right.
But then,
go ahead.
Oh, but then, the hurdy-gurdy then transitioned. It was made into a smaller package and then became an instrument for just regular people to play. But there was a progression there that started with the church.
Yeah, and it became smaller. And you were talking about, too, like it used to be kind of a box shape. But then go ahead and what was that?
This is so cool to me. And this feels like there's sometimes when truth is stranger than fiction. And just weird stuff happens in real life, and that's one of the hardest things to write, I think, is the weird stuff that actually happens in real life. And we'll talk about that a little bit later with our Reddit question. But originally, hurdy-gurdies were box-shaped. They were literally rectangular boxes, and it had a little lid that flipped open, and you can turn the crank and what have you. But at some point, they had an excess of lute bodies, like the bodies of the instrument called the lute,
like these bowl shaped kind of
the bowl rounded ones that you'd recognize, and like, we have all these lute bodies lying around, we need to make more hurdy-gurdies, so let's just put the hurdy-gurdy in the lute body, and then we'll there you go. And now most of them are that way. A lot of the hurdy-gurdies are that lute shape, because they just happen to have those lying around, and so they put them in.
And that became just the way the hurdy-gurdies were.
Yeah, they made both, but from then on they kind of made both of them.
Yeah,
like, it's just one of those weird things, and that can be the way. Again, this is maybe a little bit of a, I don't know if it's a segue or a tangent. We can kind of decide, but use that kind of thing when it comes to making your own stuff, making your own instruments, if that's what you're doing. Things happen in weird ways, and musical instruments are one of those things that are so complex and so weird by their very nature, sort of, that sometimes that's how they come about, is just by, putting this with that and seeing what happens. And that's an example there of that happening.
Yeah, and all kinds of weird things go into it. Like in Mexico, there's an instrument, I can't remember what it's called, but it's basically a guitar they make out of a armadillo's shell as the body of it. All kinds of cool stuff like that can be totally incorporated. Ideas that you have for unique things about your fauna or flora in your world, or materials available to you. Like maybe in Africa, there's an instrument that has it's like a xylophone with wooden blocks that you hit. But underneath are these gourds that act as like resonators. They're really cool. So these dried gourds are made into instruments. All kinds of cool stuff like that. Technology level is something you want to be aware of, though, because you're not going to have a modern violin, or even a 17th century
like a
violin.
Primitive violin, even.
Yeah, you're not going to have that in somewhere like America in 1000 AD or something like that.
Yeah.
The technology level just wasn't advanced enough. And you'd think it would be, because all it is a bunch of wood, right? And then some catgut strings, or maybe steel strings if you have them, and then some horsehair. And they had all those things. Well, not horses yet, actually, but
they existed. There's something.
It's pretty simple stuff, but and then the glue, which is made out of animals as well. But the actual process by which those instruments came about only could happen in a society that progressed past hunter-gatherer / agricultural, purely agricultural society, where you have people who specialize in something like making instruments, and because it's a very labor and time-intensive process that could be better used for the things that you need to actually survive, unless you have a society that's sufficiently advanced to actually be able to invest that much time and effort by individual people over generations in developing the different layer upon layer of innovation to get something like a violin, which is quite specific.
Well, and it also takes an understanding of things like acoustics and tone wood, and the way all that stuff works and goes together. It's really, the instrument itself is made of simple materials, and you could even argue is simple in construction, though it's not really true. But the ideas that go into it are pretty complex and specific.
Yeah, and basically we're still modeling violins today off of violins from the early 1700s, late 1600s. by Stradivari and Guarneri and all those guys. And the violins from Cremona, Italy at that time have something special about them, but whether they don't really know what it is yet. They've theorized that it's something about the wood that they had available to them during the time, maybe some sort of mold that was in the wood that, you know, conditioned it a certain way, or something, like maybe something in the air, something in the water, I don't know. But something was special about that time and that place, and that's kind of a cool thing too that can,
Yeah.
You know, I even had an idea one time that based on, you know, this magical world I was creating, I guess the mother in the story kind of had died like 10 years ago, and their father had, you know, some sort of ability to magically impart energy into her, I guess, burial site, and planted a seed there, and this tree grew out of the seed, and this really beautiful black wood, almost like ebony, and they made a violin out of it eventually, and it was like with this really interesting kind of idea that was very meaningful to the character and that kind of stuff. So you can do all kinds of fun stuff like that.
Yeah. That's a cool idea. I like that.
Another weird idea that I had, just kind of another idea maybe for you guys to think about, is, you know, underwater music. I had a underwater kind of island society one time that I was making, and I actually did a lot of research for it. There's an interesting band. I cannot think of their name for the life of me, but it's like the only example of a band or like a group that plays music underwater that I could find. And there's these really interesting and actually kind of haunting videos of them like submerged in these tanks playing these instruments. And there's one...
It's so weird.
It's very weird and sounds so otherworldly. It's crazy. Like everything in the air that sounds a certain way sounds totally different underwater. Like he was bowing a violin. I don't know how, because water makes the rosin go like completely slack. But he was doing something somehow. He was bowing a violin, and it sounded like this muted, just like, you know, dark, buzzy sound. The only thing that really works well underwater is percussion.
Yeah, I would imagine so.
These bells and stuff they had. And also they figured out how to kind of sing underwater by trapping an air bubble in your mouth. And kind of controlling, you know, the flow of air in and out.
This is way beyond me.
So you don't let the air out of your mouth. It just kind of, you know, has this constant bubble in your mouth. You're kind of singing through, and it's this weird, like, almost like a theremin sound. You know that.
I know what I'm looking up after this.
It's really cool. You should look it up. I'll try to find it and maybe post it in the article or something. But that was a really cool idea. I liked a lot, and it was kind of this interesting element of this island society kind of thing.
Yeah, and it goes back to kind of something we talked about before is, you know, if you're going to go about making your own instruments, or you're going to go about making your own style of music for your characters or your culture to participate in, you know, take something that is grounded in reality and put your own twist on it, you know. And that's why we mentioned things like the hurdy-gurdy, like with the wheel, or, you know, interesting, you know, African instruments with the gourds for you know, the percuss sort of with the gourds and stuff. These things are weird, and they seem like they're fictional, but they're not. They're real things that are grounded in absolute, you know, reality, and you can use those, you know, weird elements, those things that seem on the fringe of what makes sense, and craft them into your own things,
compared to what you're used to, at least
compared to what we see as normal, certainly,
and the tropes that are usually present in these sorts of stories.
Right. You know, there's a lot of what I see almost always is basically in every fantasy story that has instruments, they're all the sort of Victorian era, the lute or the lyre or the rebec, or,
well, that's,
you know,
a little before Victorian era, but yeah.
Well, whatever was there.
Whatever era it was.
Those medieval instruments. I'm equating medieval with Victorian, and that's a mistake.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but those are the ones you see, and you can use those, but that's not. That doesn't tell us anything about your culture. That doesn't tell us anything about your world or your people or your characters.
And that's kind of the last thing we want to talk about is incorporating that into the culture and the religion, maybe, and that element of culture too, of your world. Like in John's story, he has like this one overarching empire kind of, and maybe wherever that empire came from, it's very, you know, plausible, and this has happened in history, that they would maybe outlaw certain types of music. That actually happens in my story as well. That's
right. Or even just bring their own music with them, and that kind of becomes the norm, kind of squashing out the other, even if it's not explicitly banned or
Definitely.
anything.
Yeah, or it gets incorporated into the music that's traditional there, and maybe some of the older characters might think that's sort of this abomination. Like
It's like blasphemy or something.
You put triplets into your fiddle tunes? What? That kind
I
of
think
thing.
that every Thursday. You put triplets in there? How dare you?
How dare you? But no, there is different like styles of fiddle playing in Scotland and Ireland actually, and they're
Sure.
unique to these different regions, and that's not necessarily the same sort of thing, but that could be something where a certain style comes in and starts becoming predominant, and people who know about these things know that that's a style that's foreign to this place, and they might feel resentment that that's kind of replacing the style that they grew up with, or that kind of thing. And if it's like foreign oppressor, even more so. And that can be, an illustration of the conflict that's existing in your society, in your world,
Right.
In an interesting way. And the same is the opposite. If somebody starts playing music that's, native to this place, and kind of defiantly doing it, even though it might be banned or frowned upon or anything like that, that could be an interesting thing as well. And you
Yeah.
don't have to know exactly what it sounds like. You don't have to know exactly even what the differences are between the styles necessarily, especially in your first draft. Might be interesting to flesh that out later, but that can be an interesting idea to demonstrate that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it sets cultures apart from one another if you use it that way.
Yeah, they're like dialects. The same with language could be used. If they're speaking a certain language that's been either banned, or a dialect of a language that's been banned, or very identifiably places them from this certain place, and they start doing that anyway, or maybe they or their language gets kind of influenced by the oppressor's language. It's the same
Right.
kind of thing, because music is in many ways a type of language,
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, anything else to mention there?
No, I think we can definitely move on.
Okay, cool. We didn't have a whole lot to talk about from our own writing this week because we didn't have a whole lot of time to write.
Yeah.
Both of us were pretty busy this week, but we did a little bit. A couple things kind of popped out for us in our writing process. For those of you who might not be regular listeners, John and I are both writing novels, and this whole thing is us trying to work our way through our own writing, and also maybe gives you guys some ideas in how to approach, especially like your first draft,
Yes.
From a writing perspective. And this week, both of us ran into situations where we hadn't really planned in our plot, which we did before this. In our first 4 episodes or so, we came up with a 27 chapter or beat summary structure for our stories, and we both were writing this week in chapters that we hadn't really planned for, and kind of came up with some interesting things. Do you want to go ahead and start, John?
Sure. So there's mainly 2 aspects to mine, and I'll start with this. The main reason I didn't get much writing done this week was partially due to not having a lot of time, but the other one came down to, when we did our 27 beat structure, we outlined what we thought our story was going to do, and for the most part we both done that. But as we go, you kind of realize that there are scenes and there are elements that need to be there that you didn't plan on, and you're essentially faced with a choice. You can either ignore it for now and come back and do it later, or you can kind of stop for a second, plot that out and then keep going. And that's what I've chosen to do, is take a brief break from the writing to figure out what I want to happen in this section I hadn't planned for, and then proceed. And part of that process ended up being coming up with a couple new characters. And this is the thing that we seem to do constantly, is introduce new characters that we hadn't thought up yet, because I think characters are kind of hard to exhaustively plan out.
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly who's going to be part of your story, except for maybe the main characters from the very beginning.
You kind of find gaps where characters need to exist, and then you invent a character to fill it. In this case, it's sort of a very minor antagonist, more of a... If my story took place in a school... and I was like a high schooler, my main character was, this would be a bully. Like, that's essentially the character role, though it's more complicated than that. But taking a second to figure out the dynamic of their relationship, figuring out, because I know what I want to happen in the next chapter that I'm writing, but I don't know what that looks like or how it's going to play out, what I want to set up, or what I want to introduce. For me, stopping and thinking about all that was the best thing I could do this week. And I've spent a good bit of time thinking about that. What does that look like for you?
I kind of came up with this character kind of on a whim. I actually was writing in a chapter I had previously planned out a little bit, although not completely. And it just kind of popped into my head, this idea for this romantic interest character for the father in my story. And he's less than 50. He's not old at all.
Yeah.
His sons are in their early 20s, and it just occurred to me like they need a doctor to come out on the boat with them to do this thing. And it occurred to me that I'd not really thought of a doctor character yet.
Yeah, right.
So I, for some reason, I don't know why this came into my head, but it was like, oh, maybe this is like some old romantic interest he had that he like proposed to, back in the day when he was young, and then she turned him down to go and study medicine, and then came back after he had already been married, and their mom is out of the picture now. And so it was just this interesting idea, like, oh, that'd be an interesting little relationship to have, and something,
yeah, right.
an interesting element to just throw in there and see what happens, kind of thing. Because I have this tendency, I think, I don't know if this is super common or not, but I have like the main plot of my story pretty well in hand, but I have like no B plots, no subplots really planned out. I'm not really good at that.
Yeah,
Never really had a good handle on that, and I'm kind of, I guess, discovering those as I go along.
Right.
Yeah. There's the same thing with another character who's like this drunken friend of their dad's, who's this other sailor that they have to go and like convince to help them. And he's just like super funny kind of drunk character. Not that alcoholism is funny, kids.
PSA.
PSA, yeah. So yeah, I that keeps it fun for me. That keeps the enthusiasm going for me. Is coming up with those interesting new characters and trying them out. Like I had another one that I was thinking I would do, and then wrote a little bit of that scene, and it just wasn't working. So I was like, okay, I don't like that. So
yeah, I think it would be exhausting to write without discovering anything new for yourself as you go. I think that would be just kind of tiring.
Yeah, I think that the Kevin J. Anderson method, which is like to do a very rough general outline, like a paragraph or two, and then flesh that out a little bit more, flesh that out a little bit more, and flesh it out a little bit more until you have like basically a whole book is impressive. And I would like to try that again someday, but that seems pretty difficult for me.
Yeah, I don't know.
I like writing in scene in prose and with the characters actually speaking and that kind of stuff. But again, I've not tried everything in the world, so maybe that is an effective method for some people.
No, certainly for
him.
For me, certainly it's an entertaining process for me to enter into a scene where I know the basics of what's going to happen, and as I go about making those things happen, I discover 5 other smaller things that I want to happen as well.
And the danger is, making it not interesting for yourself and just kind of executing those plot points in the scene instead of, thinking of cool ways and clever ways and fun ways to spice it up a little bit as you go while still having those same events happen. And that's what I'm trying to do with this new character and the other character, and new characters are a good way to do that. Spice those scenes up a little bit and keep it interesting. And also, I'm finding I have a hard time. I think we talked a little bit about this too. I'm having a hard time making my characters flawed. I think they're too kind of perfect. They're not perfect.
Yeah,
but they're too nice. They're too like.
They're likable for everyone, and
right.
They have no major like glaring issues.
Yeah, and they have some conflict with the brothers and that kind of stuff in my story, but it's like, I don't want to do this. I do want to do this. Well, what do we do? Well, I guess I'm mad at you now, kind of thing. It's not like a character flaw either of them really has that's leading to that. I mean, maybe it is, but I can flesh that out a lot more. But yeah, introducing more characters and seeing how your characters interact with those characters can kind of maybe give you a better idea of their personality too, and how they deal with this weird person over here can give you some insight into who that character is.
Yeah, especially when for whatever reason that character, the new one, you can write them in such a way that they bring something out of your existing characters.
Right.
They can sort of press that button that triggers their bad side, that triggers the stuff that's not great about them. And that gives the readers a chance to see it.
And it gives you a chance to see it and maybe incorporate that from now on in the rest of your draft, and then go back and add that to the earlier bits.
Yeah, you see, like when someone acts like this towards my character, he responds this way. I can use that.
Yeah. Totally, yeah. Well, let's move on to our Reddit question because we're running short on time here. Let's jump into that.
Shout out to the World Builders Reddit page. I don't want to get this wrong. That is reddit.com/r/worldbuilding. I've talked to the moderators over there, and they're really nice people. We post our show and our article on there I'm asking some Reddit questions there as well, and they seem to respond really, really well to it. So this week's Reddit question was, is there a world-building element that you feel like gets undervalued and underutilized? I gave the example because that's kind of something I'm looking at in my story, is the geology, with the metals that exist and in what quantities. I feel like they can change things in your stories. I feel like that doesn't get utilized very often, and I wanted to see what the good people of the world building Reddit had to say, and they had a lot to say. Over 100 responses later.
Wow.
Here we are.
We're so popular.
So the number one upvoted response to this was culture, which seems like an obvious one, but the way he phrased it made it make a lot of sense. So essentially, he's saying a lot of fantasy stories have races, and that's elves, dwarves, men,
sack races, three-legged races.
Oh gosh, I don't want to do this with you right now. Okay, orcs, whatever. I'm just gonna ignore what you said, and we sort of end up treating those races as different ethnic groups almost. They have traits and cultures that are specific to them. But what doesn't get explored as often is actual, human races, ethnicities and cultures and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah, totally. Especially
that doesn't get
fantasy
explored as
books,
much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like in my story, there's lots of provinces that were united under this bigger governmental structure, like maybe 40 years ago. It's probably an important aspect then to maintain that those provinces probably didn't all get along before. They probably are kind of their own entities that are forced to, quote, coexist.
They might have their different religions, different
religions, cultural
practices.
divides, different value systems, stuff like that. And that goes a long way to making your world feel more lived in. So I really like that answer.
But also, I think going the opposite direction too can be interesting if you're doing that and having multiple countries and realms and that kind of stuff. Maybe not making them all completely different. Maybe making two that maybe split sometime not that far in the past, maybe that have diverged slightly, but still have a lot of commonalities. Because I feel like oftentimes when people do this and make things different, they make them too different. Like they're like,
yeah,
these are the ice people, these are the fire people, these are the earth people.
Yeah, right.
In the woods.
Well, I mean, like
whatever.
look at America versus Europe. Like we diverged a good little bit ago, and our cultures so far largely the same.
Yes, it might be one thing for the difference between in the macro sense between like America and Europe, but there's a lot of micro differences as well. Like between Italy and Poland, for example, or something like that. Even though they're both European, they're both look somewhat similar, I guess. Objectively speaking, but they're still different, especially in the micro sense. So make there be like a kind of a macro sense in which they might have the same sort of, philosophical history, sort of Western culture in general, sort of Greek philosophy, history, that kind of stuff. But, there's still differences. There's still like sort of those more detailed micro differences at the same time, as opposed to something like, a tribe in the Amazon compared to, somebody in Russia right now, that kind of thing.
Right.
That's a pretty much bigger divide. So, use your discretion depending on geography and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Varying degrees of difference.
Yeah, definitely.
Another one that we kind of touched on earlier, someone said, world building random chance into your world.
Yeah.
He says, like, so many times we make worlds that are like poetic and really, really flowing and really well put together and everything makes sense. But sometimes, the way he phrases it, sometimes the great savior dies because he falls off his horse. Sometimes a battle is lost because it rained.
Not
sometimes
if he's destined to save everyone, John.
Well, you know what? Your little comments are useless today. Man, I lost my train of thought because of you.
Mission accomplished.
But putting random chance into your well-defined story is not only interesting, but it's also highly realistic because stuff happens that we can't predict and you can't understand and foresee. And I think we need to resist the temptation to feel like that's too random. Like putting stuff like that is random because it is, but it's real.
Yeah, you don't want like essential plot elements to feel random, but again, in the minutia, in like the I don't know, like the day-to-day kind of happenings, this person, I think George R.R. Martin does this pretty well, actually. Like, this person died off screen while we weren't even, covering him as a perspective character. Like, this
He's
main
gone?
character, like, died off somewhere else while we're in somebody else's perspective. And you're just like,
great.
what?
I liked him.
That might be an extreme example, but something like that could be cool.
But sure. People said things like wind and ocean currents.
Well, let's not get too crazy.
You're getting in the weeds a little bit there, potentially.
That's second, third draft stuff.
Yeah, that's or never draft.
Or never draft.
In creating your own sort of interesting geography is one of these. He's talking about intellectual and literary history, this guy. Creating a feel that there's a unique history to the world and the literature is a certain way. Like, these are aspects that sort of pseudo-medieval cultures have. There's literature, there's history, and there's all these various cultural elements that you don't need to go into much detail about, mostly because it's not that interesting unless your main character is like a librarian, because then you may talk about that a little more. But that doesn't sound like a great book necessarily. Although, if you write a story about a librarian, I might read it.
And that can be an interesting way to kind of almost reverse engineer a culture, is to kind of determine what the history of their philosophical thought is, almost, and kind of pick from real life maybe, or come up with some interesting ideas yourself. But like, what is the history of what they think about morality, or property rights, or that kind of stuff, and how does that influence the culture that has developed over time?
Yeah.
And where they are now, kind of thing. I mean, I don't know if I 100% support that, because that sounds very world building up front, but whatever.
Yeah, I don't know if that goes with our mantra, but
right.
we'll give it a pass. I'll stop there, but I love Reddit for this reason. Like, someone said, "Oh, I think world building rivers is pretty cool," and that divulged into like a discussion of what river bifurcation means and how many times a river could segment before it becomes a little stream, and like rabbit holes aplenty on Reddit, which is why it's such a cool platform.
I think that is one of the biggest traps though to get into, is map making. For people. I feel like that is such a big sinkhole time wise to get into.
It doesn't matter until you're like ready to publish.
Right, that's something you don't need to worry about for a long time.
Yeah.
Figure out what is essential for the story you want to tell, and then make the map later after.
Tell the story first. The story is what's important.
The geography should not dictate the story. The story should dictate the geography.
Right. Right. So we'll stop there. There's a ton of responses. If you look at my profile, which is what is my profile?
Ooh, did we forget?
WBA_podcast on Reddit. You can find me there and find the discussion through there. There's a lot there, a lot of stuff to read. Engage in the conversation over there if you want to. Probably going to do another question this week on that same Reddit, the world building Reddit page. Look for my handle. Once again, that's WBA_podcast on there. Asking a question. If you want your response to be read on the show, just make a good response. Just be better than you are, and you might get a chance to be read on the podcast.
That is common advice from John.
Do better than you're currently doing.
Try harder
and you
to win.
Might be able to be on here.
That's a little red versus.
Or just email us. If you email us, you'll probably end up on the show.
Or check us out on Instagram and Facebook at World Builders Anonymous. Check us out on our website. Article will be posted there, as well as the episode and that kind of stuff. Although if you're already listening to the episode, then it doesn't really matter, I guess. The website is worldbuildersanonymous.com.
Yes, and if you feel generous, as I like to say, we do want your money, but as of yet, we don't have a way to collect it. So instead, we will accept as legal tender your iTunes review. Go to iTunes, find us, World Builders Anonymous, and leave us a generous 5-star review with glowing praise, and we will be eternally grateful.
Just don't try to write that off on your tax return.
It does not work that way.
Apparently.
That is,
they frown upon that.
The IRS will be supremely confused. although, is that a bad thing?
Well, that's a subject that we can definitely talk about some other time.
Oh boy.
Oh boy. Anyway, well, thank you guys for listening. We will see you next week. Check out our social media. Keep an eye out for that article and on Reddit for the question. And we'll hopefully see you next week.
Well, there's no hopeful about it. We'll be here next week. That's what we do.
Well, it's not, we're hoping they'll be here next week.
Oh, yeah.
We'll be
Please
here next
come
week.
back.
Please come back.
Please.
Anyway, we'll see you guys later.
Bye.
This show is sponsored in part by Audible. Visit worldbuildersanonymous.com/audible to check out what the guys are listening to right now and to receive a free audiobook.